George VI famously said that Lilibet was his pride, but 4-year-old Margaret was his joy. Elizabeth was so aware of Margaret's discontents as the also ran that she did everything she could to placate her. Robert Lacey records how a cook from 145 Piccadilly, the family's London residence from 1927 to 1937, said Princess Elizabeth would go out of her way to spare Margaret the worst duties of the girls' character-building housework by taking them on herself. Hello, welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I'd like to earn your subscription today. We are on episode 11 of the Palace Papers. And last episode, we got into the relationship between the Queen and Prince Philip. Today, we're going to extend that conversation, and we're also going to get into the Queen's relationship with her beloved sister, Margaret. So, I do have a couple of quick things to share with you. One is just a Christmas gift that was really fun that I got, and I thought you all would appreciate it perhaps more than anybody. My husband got this off of Etsy and said he thought it would be great for me to do for my channel. So I have started filling in the various books that I have done on the channel, but there's plenty more. So hopefully you will enjoy these with me along the way. But right now we have this one going, the Palace Papers, and we're finishing up the green one, which is Chappaquiddick. So I just thought that was really fun and special. Another thing I want to let you guys know is just a heads up that I do have an episode coming probably this week where we will just chat through JFK assassination related resource together. So be on the lookout for that. That's just kind of a bonus topic that you guys know I occasionally like to delve into. And then, of course, we have our final episodes of Chappaquiddick happening probably this week. So any and all of that you can be a part of. I would love for you to join. But today we are getting right into Tina Brown's The Palace Papers. The Queen's happy place has always been Balmoral. On the eve of Philip's funeral, she chose to release a shot of them relaxing together on the hills of Coils of Muick, taken by Sophie Wessex in 2003. Philip sprawls on the picnic blanket rug with his hand placed jauntily on his right knee, and the smiling Queen is her version of informal, in a tartan skirt, blouse, and cardigan, and a string of pearls. That's funny. It is a version of informal for her that would be formal for a lot of us, to wear pearls, to be wearing a skirt, to have a blouse and a cardigan. That's dressing up for a lot of us, but for her that was dressing down. The air of unassailed contentment says it all. Balmoral is so sequestered from the world that in pre-COVID times, the family could withdraw into its 50s time warp. It was easy to imagine you had just stumbled into the 1969 period piece, the BBC documentary Royal Family. There's a reason the sovereign could feel so profoundly detached from the mood of the British people during the crowd's hysteria over Diana's death. The Highland estate is literally its own world. Purchased by Prince Albert for Queen Victoria in 1848, the castle, with its turrets and spires, is a little like a piece of Bavaria dropped into a Scottish forest. The Queen has spent 3 months at Balmoral every year since the first summer of her life in 1926. I didn't realize it had been that much at that place, so no wonder it's so dear to her. That makes a lot more sense. I guess I just thought of it as like a vacation home that they would go to occasionally, but to spend 3 months there every year is a significant portion of your life. That's not a third of your life. That's a fourth of your life. It's still a quarter of your life spent in this place with such regular revisiting of places that are dear to you and making memories there. It's no wonder it's special to her. When Her Majesty's dark green Range Rover sweeps into the drive, the entire staff, including 17 gardeners, 5 cooks, and 4 scullery maids, forms a chorus line to greet her at the entrance. It's the moment the monarch can exhale and know she is at last free of irksome royal engagements to be her true self. The Queen is a countrywoman to her well-trod wellies, Until the age of 85, she was known to be an accomplished picker-up, following the guns on shooting parties to wring the necks of wounded birds or knocking them on the head with a priest, a sort of miniature police baton with a weight at the end. That's a funny picture, actually, of her crawling and coming along to pick up the shot birds. Her cousin and lifelong friend, the late Honorable Margaret Rhodes, said how much the young Elizabeth always relished crawling on her stomach through the undergrowth, with her nose up to the soles of the stalker's boots, until she was close enough to take aim. The beast would then be disemboweled, strapped on the back of a horse, taken down to the castle larder for skinning, and served the following week for dinner. The meat had to be kind of tenderized. Her Majesty killed her last stag in 1983. Dogs are one of her few areas of visible sentiment. Dogs and horses are her true emotional peers, Tina Brown writes. They have no interest in her rank, love her for herself, and never bore her by asking what Winston Churchill was really like. That probably was one of the number one questions she got, because the older she got, the more she became the only person who had actually interacted with him that anybody had any chance of spending time with. So it makes sense that that would be a most common question that would totally bore her. The Queen rarely watches television in the afternoon unless it's a horse race. But on 11th of September 2001, she was in her Balmoral sitting room, mesmerized by the calamitous images pouring out of New York City. The last time she had beheld anything close to the World Trade Center destruction was during the Blitz, and in the photographs that followed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, an event that at last brought President Roosevelt to Winston Churchill's aid in the war. The nightmarish scenes of the terrorist attack coincided with a phone call, bringing the Queen devastating personal news. The 77-year-old Earl of Carnarvon, Porchy, had suffered a fatal heart attack at Highclere Castle. His wife said that Carnarvon, too, had been watching the coverage of the attacks. He became agitated and collapsed, dying in the ambulance. Once again, as with the death of Diana, the magical remoteness of Balmoral was pierced by inescapable human pain. What a sorrow. And for her, this dear friend with whom she had collaborated for decades about one of the subjects most dear to her. That would be such a blow. Multiples of human loss on the other side of the Atlantic collided with the Queen's own intimate bereavement at home. The terrorist attacks in the U.S. were a chance to show a more caring and responsive monarchy to British allies. Lessons had been learned from the death of Diana. There could be no hiding from history at Balmoral. The Queen immediately blessed the comptroller's idea for a new twist on the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. On 12th of September, the Coldstream Guards marched down the Mall to selections by American military composer John Philip Sousa. The tribute to the dead in the palace courtyard opened with the Star-Spangled Banner, played to thousands of mourning expatriates from America who had assembled in front of the palace. They closed with God Save the Queen, which shares a melody with America's My Country 'Tis of Thee, offering a particularly powerful resonance. The formal acknowledgement of America's tragedy was both emotionally and diplomatically perfect. Certainly a lesson learned after Diana. It's interesting that she connects those two, because I think I even mused about this, did I? In one of the earlier episodes about this, wondering if the response to 9/11 was something different because of Diana. I don't know. I think I did, which is interesting, because here she says, yes, in fact, it was a lesson learned from that. At a memorial service in New York City 6 days later, various dignitaries gathered. But it was the Queen who expressed the most memorable thought in the closing line of the message she sent from England. It was read from the pulpit by the somber ambassador, Christopher Meyer. These are dark and harrowing times for families and friends of those who are missing or who suffered in the attack. Many of you here today. My thoughts and my prayers are with you all now and in the difficult days ahead. But nothing that can be said can begin to take away the anguish and the pain of these moments. Grief is the price we pay for love. The Queen was providing solace to the relatives of the victims, but I tend to think that the final sentence was prompted by a private as well as a public loss, that of Portia, her comrade and comforter of 60 years. Grief is the price we pay for love. That is very poignant and true, that grief is the price we pay for love. I think we all feel it the older we get. The longer we live, and she had lived a long time at this point, we understand the ways that those two complicated things of grief and love are intertwined, that not only grieving the loss of people we love, but grieving things that are left unsaid, grieving relationships that perhaps when somebody dies, things are still not at rest between you. The emotion of love brings with it many kinds of grief. We're to chapter 6 now, Swan Songs. Margaret and the Queen Mother leave the party. And I just want to say, I think in today's episode, we're only going to get through the Margaret portion. We will get through the Queen Mother portion in our next video. When Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 meant that their shy, stammering father was unexpectedly going to become the king, Margaret, then 6 years old, asked her 10-year-old sister if this foretold that she would be queen one day. Lilibet replied, "Yes, someday." "Poor you," said Margaret. Whether there was sympathy or suppressed envy in Margaret's response, the dividing paths of the sisters' future lives were early drawn. The dynamics of their relationship never really changed. It was Sense and Sensibility made regal. I love that comparison. The glamorous, mercurial Margaret rose, and the graver, more conventional Elizabeth, protecting and reproving her wayward sibling. That's very apt. A guards officer friend of Margaret observed, "The Queen was always able to handle her sister, and with much greater skill than she handled her children. If Margaret didn't want to do something, the Queen would smilingly say, 'Oh, all right,' as if to say, 'You won't be missed.' That usually brought her to heel." Even after the Queen was increasingly, and for Margaret, painfully captured by her duties as monarch, the sisters still spoke on the phone every day. Margaret was the only person on the planet who always knew Elizabeth as a peer, exchanging gossip, complaining about their mother, understanding the world through the same peculiar royal prism. When Margaret traveled abroad, she always unpacked a small, silver-framed photograph of the Queen to hang on her wall or place on her dresser. Isn't that sweet? One thing I love about their relationship is that even though there was hard things that had happened between them, and even times when Queen Elizabeth had had to stand up, like with Group Captain Townsend, and shut down things that meant great sorrow for Margaret, that she didn't cut off her sister. She didn't wallow in bitterness. She didn't go public and publish terrible things about her. She didn't run off into exile in some, far-flung country where she could live a beautiful life on the beach in obscurity. She stayed near her sister, and even this little detail of the photograph tells us she dearly loved her. She held her as precious in her life. It wasn't just some sort of ceremonial cover of trying to make the best of it so you could retain your royal status or something like that. She genuinely adored her sister. Elizabeth sometimes envied Margaret's talent to amuse, saying, "Oh, it's so much easier when Margaret's there. Everybody laughs at what Margaret says." The younger sister could enjoy freedoms that were inevitably out of bounds for the monarch. Elizabeth was apparently particularly envious of a trip Margaret took with their mother in 1959 to sightsee in Rome and Paris. In all the years she has been the Queen, she has never had a proper foreign holiday or been able to say, "Oh, it's a lovely day. Let's go somewhere and take a picnic," the Queen's cousin, Margaret Rhodes, once said. It is interesting to contemplate that average people have freedoms like the ability to just go into a shop or go to a site and visit it that she didn't have. I mean, she could go to the site, but she couldn't just go and drift around and do as she pleased and not be noticed by others and not be watched by others and not have her reactions cataloged and all of it. To just be a normal person that gets to experience what you experience and go about your day and do as you please. She didn't really have that luxury. You know, even as we heard about her time at Balmoral, where she could sink into at least geographic obscurity, she still couldn't sink into actual obscurity. Her responses to matters of state and matters that were happening around the world still mattered. Whatever their difference in rank, both sisters lived in a world where everything around them was controlled by the thermostat of royalty. Specialness of position, unmoored to any tangible purpose, meant that nothing was more exotic to Margaret than the mundane. It was one of her lifelong dreams to ride on a bus. When she asked Lady Anne Glenconner to go shopping with her, she excitedly chose the dullest of high street stores. She derived childlike enjoyment from cleaning Anne's car when she came to stay with her in Norfolk. There are times in Lady in Waiting, Glenconner's memoir, when Margaret's dreams of being outside the royal cage come through with heartbreaking poignancy. In 1999, Margaret had a traumatic accident in Mustique when she turned on the hot tap instead of the cold in the bath and severely scalded her feet. While the princess was convalescing and recovering from the injury, Anne moved into the single bed next to her and they were watching videos. She was thrilled and said, "Oh, Anne, is this like boarding school?" Her hunger to learn what the real world was like went unassuaged. Being denied a real education was one of Margaret's greatest regrets. Both of the princesses were taught by governesses, but Elizabeth was given stimulating tutorials by the then Vice Provost of Eton, Sir Henry Martin, on history and the British Constitution, while Margaret was fobbed off with French and piano. And I realize they were, being raised in a totally different era, but it is a little shocking to consider that somebody would think that a princess who would be a peer of the Queen, who would be interacting with all sorts of dignitaries and global leaders, that all she really needed was a little input from a governess and some French and piano. It's hard to believe for me that they didn't think, well, let's give her some history too. Let's go ahead and give her a tour of industry or an understanding of business practices or anything else that might equip her to even engage at a state dinner. Even if that's your whole purpose in life, is just to engage meaningfully with people around the globe, you'd think you'd need more than French and piano. George VI famously said that Lilibet was his pride, but 4-year-old Margaret was his joy. Elizabeth was so aware of Margaret's discontents, as the also ran, that she did everything she could to placate her. Robert Lacey records how a cook from 145 Piccadilly, the family's London residence from 1927 to 1937, said Princess Elizabeth would go out of her way to spare Margaret the worst duties of the girls' character-building housework by taking them on herself. So interesting. They were given chores that were meant to form their character, teach them, even gratitude. I mean, I don't know if you're perhaps a young parent, but I would say as much as your children can do, you should have them do. Not because they should be slaves, not because they should, do all the housework, but because they should understand what it means when they throw down their dirty sock on the ground, that someone must gather it, get it to the thing, get it washed, get it sorted, and get it back to their drawer. At some point, they need to participate in the activities that take care of them. And it's interesting to see that even Princess Elizabeth and Margaret were given chores like that, but Elizabeth took over the worst of the duties for Margaret to try to spare her, which is a fascinating character study there in their young lives. Later, the Queen felt keenly the enforced role she had to play in Margaret's reluctant repudiation of her first love, Peter Townsend, and was profoundly sad when Margaret's marriage to Tony Snowdon foundered. It was nonetheless galling to Margaret that after their divorce, Snowdon stayed on good terms with the Queen, and that her mother positively adored him. The princess felt her sister and mother weren't offended enough by Tony's infidelities, simply because, unlike hers with Roddy, he had managed to keep them quiet. So here we see again these aristocratic mores coming up, but Margaret had been found out in her extramarital affairs, and Tony had been quiet about his, and so he was able to pin the effects of the divorce and the problems in their marriage on her, even though his had been far worse and far more numerous. Nonetheless, he was able to pin that on her. Snowden succeeded in framing Margaret to the public as the guilty party, even though he had been sexually faithless since day one. During their honeymoon, his ex-girlfriend gave birth to his child. Divorce from Margaret 18 years later became urgent because the pregnancy of his mistress, Lucy Lindsay Hogg, had come about. On the 10th of February 2002, chronicles of Margaret's troubled history deluged the media. She had died in her sleep the morning before, at the age of 71, at King Edward VII's Hospital in London after cardiac problems following a stroke. At her side were the children of her marriage to Snowden. After the scalding incident in Mustique, her infirmity had been further exacerbated by the first of her strokes, and she never fully regained mobility. She was bitterly conscious of the loss of her looks and refused to see most of her old friends, especially the men. A summer visitor to Balmoral in 2001 told me that the princess was a woeful, isolated figure who rarely appeared, like a mad ant in the attic. In her last days, her eyesight deteriorated, and she lost virtually all movement on her left side. The once great goer had been sadly stilled. For those who remembered her in her glory days, the petite, curvaceous figure, the wide, sensuous mouth, and the sparkling blue cat's eyes that communicated both "come hither" and "touch me if you dare," her disintegration was shocking. The chauffeur that had cared for her for many years was appalled when he saw how ill she looked. There was public shock the last time she was seen out, wheeled with swollen face and dark glasses into the 100th birthday party of the Dowager Duchess of Gloucestershire. Obituaries for Margaret were mostly irrelevant or maudlin tributes to an unfulfilled life. The press knew too much about the only one among her generation of royals to have lived her private life in public view. The Queen was alone at Windsor Castle when she learned the news of Margaret's demise. Affairs of state had meant that she had not seen her ailing sister for a month. Given how the Queen often deploys the demands of work to avoid difficult emotional interactions, she perhaps couldn't bear to see the last miserable decline of a sister with whom she had shared so much. That's that famous ostriching that she does. The death of Margaret, only 5 months after the passing of her best male friend, Porchy, was a heavy personal blow for the Queen. It's like her best female friend and her best male friend in a span of 5 months. Can you imagine? After decades with each of them. She was now bereft of her most intimate companion and beloved sibling who helped fill the void of her uniquely lonely position as a monarch. Lilibet and her 101-year-old mother were now the dwindling remnants of us four, which is what George, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Elizabeth called themselves, us four. Only 2 are left, and clearly that would not be for long. The Queen Mother had recently had a series of falls, and everyone had expected her to go first. Prince Charles drove straight to Norfolk to comfort his grandmother at Sandringham. "This is a terribly sad day for all my family," he said in a televised address. "She loved life and lived it to the full. We shall all miss her dreadfully." I want to pause and just say the British ways of expressing things are far more impactful than Americans. For example, somebody talking about Prince Charles's incandescent rage or anger. We don't talk about that in America, but it's a perfect word for when somebody is just bursting and glowing with anger. It's the perfect word for it. And then this, just the way that I think we don't use words like dreadfully anymore. But these are simple words that he said, but impactful about his aunt. He had a deep fondness for his Aunt Margot, as he called her, even though she stood by Diana's side during their marital difficulties. With her unpredictability and panache, Margaret had been the Diana of her day, and she knew what it was like to be the media's chew toy. She had told Charles she was going to continue her association with Diana after they separated, which is very interesting. A resolve that went out the window after Diana's Martin Bashir interview, which Margaret considered rank disloyalty to the Queen. It's interesting. This made me think a little bit about Harry and Meghan and how after Oprah, I think some of the relationships with his cousins cooled. So Eugenie and Beatrice, they had enjoyed a previously close relationship that sort of appeared at least to go unmarred by everything that happened with their departure from the royal family and then his kind of problems with Prince William. But after Oprah, I think Oprah was sort of a similar thing to this Martin Bashir, where it's a line in the sand where you've revealed things that you can't walk back from, and you've damaged the institution that is the foundation for your family members' whole existence. Every charity act they go on, every tour that they go and view Commonwealth nations, every time they host a state dinner, they are participating in the thing that you have trashed or diminished or made weaker. And it was true about Harry and Meghan, and I think it affected the relationships with Beatrice and Eugenie, as well as the rest of the family. But especially those relationships where ties like this with Margaret had been kept. Margaret was like, no, this going to Martin Bashir, this is rank disloyalty. No more. The Queen Mother told Charles that Margot's death had probably been a merciful release. And after they prayed together in the chapel at Sandringham, she stayed on to mourn her daughter's loss alone. Their relationship had been complicated. Throughout their lives, Margaret and her mother had dueled and bickered, a slightly strained relationship, Lady Anne Glenconner called it. One would do things like open all the windows, only for the other to go around shutting them. One would suggest an idea, and the other would dismiss it immediately. Perhaps they were too similar. Both loved the limelight and competing for attention. They outdid each other at charades, or what I learned on Royal Palace Confidential this last week was that you guys say charades. So that was interesting. I think Jo Elvin, is that her name? The host, she's from Australia. And so she said charades like we do in America. But the other two said, well, it's actually, we call it charades. So they outdid each other at charades. Both Margaret and her mother felt remaindered when Elizabeth acceded to the throne at age of 25. Stuck with each other, their most challenging years together followed the Queen's coronation, when they had to move out of their home at Buckingham Palace into the much smaller Clarence House. The Queen knew how marginalized they felt. Mummy and Margaret have the biggest grief to bear, for their future must seem very blank, while I have a job and a family to think about. Glenconner recalled how a private film captured 22-year-old Margaret looking forlorn following the coronation. Margaret later told Anne, "Of course I looked sad. I had just lost my beloved father, and really, I had just lost my sister because she was going to be so busy." The more immersed Elizabeth became as queen, the more excluded Margaret felt, and the less she had to do. Margaret became a late sleeping party girl to fill the languid days, offending her mother's tireless work ethic. For her part, the Queen mostly considered the bouts of depression and excessive drinking of Margaret's earlier years a cry for attention. Rarely sick herself, the Queen considered stamina to be a moral as well as a physical attribute. A Balmoral guest told me that both the Queen and Prince Philip were clearly irritated by what they saw as an element of carelessness in Margaret's accident in Mystique with her feet. She viewed her sister's wheelchair as an almost theatrical indulgence. On mother-daughter visits to Buckingham Palace, a duel took place. Margaret would make a beeline for the wheelchair, readied by a footman, and intended for her mother, as the two of them exited the elevator. "For God's sake, Margaret, get out! That's meant for Mummy," remarked the Queen. The passive-aggressive dynamic between them suggested they both declined to accept the reality of Margaret's condition. It's just interesting to hear this, because I think we all have this tendency to, we have seen perhaps a negative trait so long in somebody that later when there might be, it's like the boy who cried wolf, right? Later when there might be an actual reason for it, we might overlook it because we're in such a long habit of going, oh yeah, she's dramatic about everything, or oh, he's an exaggerator. He'll say whatever to make a good story or whatever. That probably didn't happen quite like that, or it probably wasn't that bad, or whatever. We can minimize because of our long familiarity with someone. And here, her sister had actual legitimate injuries that later led to, made complications for when she had strokes and things like that, and that led to her death. But she just kind of was like, oh, come on, let mom have the wheelchair. There was heartfelt sorrow among Margaret's staff on her death. She was a decent boss, and they had stayed with her for decades. Chauffeur David Griffin said she was loyal as long as you stayed within the old school guidelines of due deference. He told me, Princess Margaret was kind to everyone. She treated them properly, and she wasn't petty. She would always give you a present at Christmas, but strangely, she would never wrap them. If, for example, you wanted an iron, she would call you into her rooms, and she would just give it to you in a box without wrapping paper. It was just, thank you very much. Have a happy Christmas. Surprisingly, perhaps for one so self-involved, she was an undisputed success as a mother, affectionate and fun with her children. Sarah Chatto and David Linley, who is now the Earl of Snowdon, were devoted to her. At one moment of depressed self-recrimination, the princess told the Queen, I may not have achieved very much, but I at least feel my life has not been wasted, because I have produced 2 happy and well-adjusted children. And that is remarkable. Amidst all of the trappings of royalty, the kind of cloistered existence that they live, but then on top of that, her own broken marriage and publicity of scandal. It is a remarkable thing that her children were happy, well-adjusted, and had a good relationship with her. That remark, of course, had the usual buried Margaret zinger, but it was true. Despite the turbulence of the Snowdon marriage, Sarah and David were much less beset by emotional drama than the children of Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth. Sarah became a well-regarded painter, and David a successful designer and maker of high-end furniture. David was as miserable at his prep school as Prince Charles was at Gordonston, but unlike the Queen and Prince Philip, who insisted that Charles tough it out, Margaret unhesitatingly responded by pulling David out and sending him to another school where he was happier. During her final illness, David moved back into Kensington Palace with his wife and young son Charles to be close to her. Just a couple of days before her death, Margaret came to the 3rd birthday of Sarah's 2nd son with a helium balloon tied to her wheelchair. Her last formal portrait was released on the eve of her funeral. She had been photographed by Julian Calder, who had used reduced light and candles to avoid hurting her eyes. Looking solemn and strained in a heavy black brocade top, the princess elected to wear the diamond, pearl, and turquoise Imperial Order of the Crown of India insignia, prominently pinned on a blue ribbon. It was given to her by her father, George VI, then Emperor of India, only months before Indian independence from the British Empire and the consequent extinction of the order. That she chose to wear this grand symbol of a dead age underlined the extraordinary journey of her life. She had begun as the 2nd daughter of the Empire, yet she died stigmatized as the first immediate member of the royal family to be divorced since Henry VIII. It's interesting that she chose that. It is like a bookending of her life of sorts, that far back I was the person who received this from my father, who was the emperor over India, Britain, and the entire British Empire, which of course all disintegrated later. So it is amazing. And that's the part of British history that I don't fully know much about. I've gone back and have started trying to, educate myself a little bit on, say, 20th century British history. But I don't know a lot about that. I do know that it went from an imperial realm to the Commonwealth of Nations, where some, I believe, elected to stay under British rule. And I don't know if that was an option presented to them, or if it was just like the spirit of the age that many nations were throwing off British rule. So if you want to educate me in the comments a little bit, I'd appreciate that. And I know other readers probably would too. The funeral inside St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 15th of February 2002 was a dignified, muted affair. It was 50 years exactly since the Queen Mother, with a devastated Margaret at her side, watched as the 25-year-old new sovereign took a handful of red earth from a silver bowl and scattered it somberly on George VI's coffin before it was committed to the vault. A half-century later, his younger daughter's casket was carried by 8 servicemen. The princess had chosen the music, and Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake sounded as the mourners entered the chapel. The 450 members of the congregation were restricted to family, friends, and household staff. Afterwards, the Queen gently held the arm of her distraught niece, Lady Sarah, and helped her down the chapel steps. During the service, the Queen had shown little emotion, but the sight of her sister's coffin loaded into the hearse made her eyes glisten with tears. One of Margaret's close friends said, "It was the saddest I have ever seen the Queen." Well, that ends our reading for today. We've gotten to hear some wonderful things about their relationship, and hard things too. You know, it's interesting that she didn't see her sister for the last month of her life. One of the things I shared an episode or two ago about my husband's uncle who passed, and one of the things that was really precious to us was about 2 years ago, his other brother moved into the facility where they had lived. And for a good year, they got to eat meals together and enjoy one another in their final year of his brother's life. And that was really precious to witness. It was neat for me to see, because every day in my home, I see young brothers interacting and teasing. But it was wonderful to see, you know, a 90-year-old and his 88-year-old brother or whatever kind of ribbing each other, and they would joke. Very cute for 2 men who are losing their memories but love and know each other as brothers. And I think it is a little bit of a loss, but I understand it, that the Queen maybe couldn't bear to be around her sister in that final month. And I do understand that there is a sadness at the end with somebody who is passing away. If you love that person greatly, it would be hard to watch. Well, that is the Queen's relationship with her sister, Margaret. And next time we are going to get into the Queen's relationship with her mother, the Queen Mother. So come back for that. Let me know what you think about this episode, any observations or other stories. I think you all know this, but I am not sharing everything in this book. There are stories that remain untold. I am not just reading the chapter. I pull out the best bits that I think you would enjoy and that we can discuss together. But if you are interested in more of this, let me assure you that there is more than I am reading. There are more details, more rich just tapestry of relationship and that sort of thing that are included in Tina Brown's wonderful book. So that's a little plug. If you're interested in more, get the book. It's fascinating. Well, you guys have a great day. We'll see you soon. Bye.